You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Mark Christian Thompson, Krieger Eisenhower Professor in the Department of English at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. He is the author of 5 books: Black Fascisms, published in 2007 by University of Virginia Press; Kafka's Blues, out with Northwestern University Press in 2016; 2018's Anti-Music, Jazz and Racial Blackness in German Thought Between the Wars, published by SUNY Press; Phenomenal Blackness, which is our occasion for discussion today, appeared in late 2021 with the University of Chicago Press. And he is also the author of forthcoming Critique of Nonviolence, Martin Luther King Jr. and Philosophy. Mark, welcome. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Not too bad. I'm really excited to talk about this new book of yours. I've read your previous work and really love it. You have really such an important and really unique in terms of theoretical scholarship, or really unique sort of framing for the figures that you read and the kinds of figures that you engage. And I think this new book is such an example of that. And part of what I want to get into is why these thinkers, German critical theory, post-World War II, African-American political and literary figures. But I want to start with the question that's really open-ended, and as much as anything, an invitation for you to narrate us into the process of this book. What drew you to the project? Were there questions or concerns in your previous work that you feel were unsettled? Things that needed to be said about, critical theory, about the figures in each chapter? And I mean this in terms of, any kind of personal reflection and, what kind of intellectual curiosities made this project happen for you?
My commitment to and investments in African American literary studies and theory and philosophy, and German literary studies, theory, and philosophy had been moving, I wouldn't say parallel because they intersect in the previous books, but they hadn't really overlapped yet to the extent to which I felt they could and really sort of needed them to at this point in my thinking. And so part of that was part of the choice for looking at writers from the 60s and early 70s was this was a consideration because this is where this actually starts to happen quite overtly. A larger concern, though, was really what's the critical landscape in African American studies and Black studies more generally today. And thinking about the extent to which a type of aestheticized theory has really sort of taken hold in many ways in some quarters as du jour in how we go about looking at and thinking about Blackness and African American literature. And I started to ask myself, well, how did this come about? How is it that criticism and poetics have merged in a way in African American literary studies to almost to the exclusion, at least in our highest profile writers and books, to the exclusion of a much more historicized way of approaching the field, which had been sort of standard previously, but in the past 15 years or so has slowly started to shift to where we are now. And I really wanted to sort of historicize the present. Why are we here? How did we get here? And saw that started to happen or became possible in the early 1960s, and primarily with Baraka's work at that time as Leroy Jones.
So, what is it that for you, this shift in period? It's just a few decades, right? But your previous work is so much about the between the wars, right? And shifting those few decades into the 1960s and 1970s. What is you spoke to it a little bit there, but I wonder, just to ask again, what that shift forward opens up for you in terms of why this new period, right? I mean, on the one hand, maybe feel exhausted by the between the wars period, but also that of course it's a post Richard Wright is just a different world for African American literary and cultural productions or post war. But what for you opens up in those decades, those first few after the Second World War?
So what I started to, I was following the trajectory of the intellectuals and the writers and the thinkers themselves to a certain
Mm-hmm.
extent, and trying to understand what happens. What
Uh-huh.
I saw was that after the war, really during it, but definitely by the late 50s, a real shift had taken place, a methodological shift had taken place, and an epistemological shift had taken place away from a much more rigorous sociological approach
Mm-hmm.
to reflections on African American culture and politics
Mm-hmm.
to something that started to incorporate critical theory and philosophy. And by philosophy, I don't mean political philosophy, but so called first philosophy or metaphysics,
Uh-huh.
where metaphysical reflection on African American life really only took place in theological settings before this. It's something that, of
Interesting.
course, one could find in Du Bois, but it's always tempered by this very clear sociological vision that he has.
Mm-hmm.
But in Baraka's work, and in Blues People in particular, we start to see someone who's calling for a much more ontological approach to race.
Mm.
And race is, what is race, and what role does it play in African American life? What does it mean to be not just Black but African American, and how does that relate as a form of being? um, this question intrigued me, and I started to wonder to what extent ontological reflections on race and Blackness not just play a part in, but actually shape debates in Black power and,
Mm.
in the King Book later, civil rights during this period and into the 70s.
Yeah, that's it's. I mean, that's one of the things I really loved about the book is thinking about that shift, um, this very shift. My own sort of framing of it or my own characterization of it was really indebted, has always been really indebted to Ellison's the World in the Jug, where he characterizes Wright's native son and Wright's fiction generally as sociological, and sort of opens up this art for art's sake or an indulgence in the depth of African American culture. But as you just put it, I mean, the book really brings out what it would mean to say culture, right?
Mhm.
Life, sort of rich sense of existential history in terms of ontology, in terms of metaphysics, in terms of epistemology. And that way of, um, I don't want to say elevating, because I do think these things are sort of horizontal relations, but
Mhm.
opening up this really complicated theoretical horizon that philosophy offers, um, to give a different shape to and contour to that critique of literature as sociology, to start to talk about it in terms of ontology, and as you say, detect it or chart it through political movements, where it's not just here's a philosophical take on the moment, but no, this philosophical turn is transforming
Mhm.
the way social movements are thinking about themselves. Yeah.
Right. The something the book really doesn't get into too much, but the forthcoming King book does, would be, for instance, I'll say two things here. One is related to Huey P. Newton, who essentially taught himself to read reading Plato's Republic, and would lecture on the Republic quite often, and made explicit references to the allegory of the cave as a form of Black consciousness and white ideology, racist ideology. So there you have, just at the very heart of the Black Panther movement, Plato, right? These are some of the things that I was fascinated. How does this work? What does it do? How does this activate
Hmm.
social movements and play out in the street or in the penitentiary or in the courthouse? Um, Something that I looked at in Phenomenal Blackness was, of course, Angela Davis's own intellectual trajectory and the time she spent at Frankfurt as actually a member of the Frankfurt School. In a sense, she's studying there
Hmm.
with Adorno. Adorno is her direct advisor. And again, these questions arise. What happens? What does that mean that for Angela Davis, her formative philosophical training is done with Herbert Marcuse or Theodor Adorno, or with the Frankfurt School, at the Frankfurt School, taking classes with Habermas and so on? It's got to be there still. It's clear in her lectures
Hmm.
on liberation from UCLA,
Yeah.
69, 70. And does it have an afterlife? Did it inform anybody else in the period? What were they reading or thinking about, or who were they listening to? And how did that
Hmm.
actually go into shaping and creating black power thought
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
civil rights thought?
And I think that remark on Newton, and you could, as you did, as you started to there, sort of write it out large. Somebody like Newton thought in terms of, I think is often remembered in terms of photographs and sound bites and militancy, but this dimension of him as an intellectual, as you say, Plato's Republic, or I'm also thinking about, he's talked about how much he thought about Descartes when he was in solitary
Hmm.
confinement, which
Mm-hmm.
is just kind of a wild thing, to the way people were writing about their incarceration in the moment was very much not like, you know, I was thinking of Descartes, but rather than about, how did, comparative, carceral reports, that idea of this intense intellectual dimension at the heart of figures largely remembered for their activism or sort of iconic character. Um,
Mm.
I think the book does that. With Davis certainly, and Baraka as well, so well. But I wanted to, you we're talking about the Frankfurt School, and I wanted to back up, maybe, or not back up, but isolate that question for a moment and ask you, and this is, of course, part of your intellectual work prior, your book writing prior. So it's clearly a part of your trajectory as an intellectual. What is it about German critical theory, which in this book, Adorno and Marcuse are centerpieces, but you also talk about Jürgen Habermas. What is it about German critical theory that makes it such a compelling interpretive frame? What do you think that you're able to draw out of the material? The African American literary and political figures through that frame that we wouldn't otherwise see. And I ask that because, of course, that's the way theory functions, right? Theory is not just a sort of boutique concern. It's a way of seeing something about a text, right? The text of the world, a written text, a figure's life that we wouldn't be able to see without that theory, without that interpretive frame. What is it about German critical theory that is so compelling for you?
So, a few things. Uh, the book I'm working on now goes back to the late 18th century and runs through the 19th century to kind of come up to that Garveyite moment and complete the circuit of what I'm thinking, or what I've been thinking about for many years, to try to show how African American intellectuals and philosophers have thought about
Mm-hmm.
race as a metaphysical property, and how that continues to inform how we think about it. And the German tradition, of course, looms large during the earlier period as well, largely because, at least through the 20th century to the 60s or so, the French tradition, or any other European tradition that they could have fallen back on, modern tradition, contemporary tradition um, didn't didn't provide a platform or an intellectual structure, philosophical structure to raise these types of metaphysical questions about race.
Mm-hmm.
They're more pragmatic in their concerns, and indeed the dominant form of French philosophy, at least for the first half of to Sartre, really, is a philosophy of science that just didn't have the kind of traction for African American philosophers who were trying to think about and push back on theologically and metaphysically informed conceptions of race and exclusion and
Mm-hmm.
racial exclusion. And so, for this reason, the German tradition works quite well because that's exactly what it did. It formulated some of the most basic philosophical forms of race and racial exclusion that we still are living with. But critical theory itself pushes back on this on its own tradition, its own intellectual
Mm-hmm.
tradition. It provides a mode of reading that one can insert and use into the philosophical text so that for African American the benefit is that you can go into something like Hegel and still take parts of Hegel's metaphysics,
Mm-hmm.
but then invert it and deconstruct it, if I dare use that term, before the fact of deconstruction itself, or in a different way
Mm-hmm.
that is less collusive with the Western tradition in general. So,
Mm-hmm.
critical theory, I would say African Americans are using critical theory, but they're also um, pushing back or using critical theory to invert itself at times
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in order to produce something that is both critique and the production of a metaphysics of race that is there in these 60s texts.
Yeah, so picking up on the other side of that of the figures at work in phenomenal blackness, um, you take the book is structured around chapters are structured around specific figures. Baldwin, Malcolm X, Ralph Ellison, Amiri Baraka, Angela Davis, Eldridge Cleaver. And what I really like about that is it allows you to, just as a scholar reading, it allows you to really treat in detail, right? Rather than sort of broad characterizations of the period or certain movements or geographies. Um, so there's like such depth in those chapters that are both, you learn a lot about James Baldwin, but you also learn a lot about what you're talking about in terms of, you know, dialectics, critical theory, and so forth. But I'm curious on in the African American side, in some ways, asking the same question I just asked about German critical theory. Why these figures? I mean, they come from a similar period, right? Expanded period, the 60s and 70s, but they have such different cultural and political sensibilities. Ralph Ellison and Miri Baraka and Malcolm X put together, not to mention Cleaver and Baldwin and all of that. But what draws their attention, your attention to them under the conceptual rubric of the book? Do you feel like the book was sort of generated through the frame of German critical theory and where it attached to figures, or is there something about this collection of figures that you think is an important portrait to draw about the post-war period of African American literature and culture?
So I think that there's it's a little bit of both, but I think it's more the latter, that there is something important about this collection of figures. And if I can try and trace that trajectory, it would be in the form of a development or an historical development or movement that takes place where a thought starts to grow and to flesh itself out, beginning with Baldwin, who acts as a bridge figure between um, the more sociological approach of previous
Mm-hmm.
generation of Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison, who's already sort of tearing with the metaphysical, but who's also still kind of firmly embedded anthropological discourse that he's strongly invested in. To Baldwin, who's moving away from this and is starting to think of hermeneutical method and language in a different way that is more philosophy based than it is
Hmm.
necessarily a pure exercise in linguistics or sociological linguistics or anything of that
Uh-huh.
nature. Um, the movement or the progression then moves to Baraka, who sort of picks up on it's not necessarily linked to a direct reaction to Baldwin, but I'm seeing a kind of general sort of movement that one experiences as a zeitgeist or however you wish to frame it.
Hmm.
But Baraka in the early 60s, who sort of completes that transition that Baldwin begins, or is the bridge figure for, where he is simply saying, we need a philosophy. We need to just think about this philosophically as opposed to sociologically or
Hmm.
anthropologically. Um, the movement to Malcolm X is, for me, was kind of a logical next step because, of course, Malcolm looms large over the 60s and beyond in any form or articulation of Black Power that we have.
Yeah.
But what I was absolutely fascinated by was how paradigmatic his experience was, or as he gives it in the autobiography, but
Hmm.
also how strange. And I go back to that prison moment where he very offhandedly says, "Oh, Kant, Nietzsche, I read them all. They're all garbage, basically, but I read them, and I
Hmm.
can speak to that tradition if I want to." And I started to wonder, well, is he? And what we see take place with Malcolm X is that philosophical thought that starts to become oriented toward the public sphere, and
Hmm.
how this becomes a practical mode of engagement as opposed to an aesthetic practice, which happens right there in that moment in prison,
Hmm.
in those prison years. Beyond that, I just move again. It starts to move sort of fluidly or almost easily to Cleaver and to Davis, because whereas Cleaver is sharing a similar penitentiary or carceral experience, what he comes away with is a full-blown admission of a certain form of reading of the Western philosophical tradition based around Marx and Lenin, which he rejects, but not entirely, as he starts to grapple with or try to formulate something that's specifically Black or African American at that
Hmm.
time, ending with Davis, who actually does that, and does that at such a high level of sophistication and with such far-reaching consequences that,
Yeah.
in my mind anyway, she culminates this movement
Hmm.
and ends it, because what happens next is there's really no following act to that. Things change
Interesting.
rapidly as
Yeah.
philosophy moves into the academy and starts to fracture.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's I'm glad I asked that question. That was a really fascinating sort of weave and set of connections there. Especially that remark about Davis sort of ending this trajectory, and the link to the, the sort of sociological existential experience of the academy in a certain moment, actually transforming this trajectory of African American thought. I think that's just a really compelling thing to sit with. So I appreciate that comment. Um, so I mean, you've started to speak to it a little bit in terms of particular figures having to do with their remarks in key texts in terms of their life trajectory. Davis studying with Marcuse and also Adorno, and this remark of X that you just cited. And so you work it out in the chapters, I think, very specifically, and started to work it out there in remarks on each figure. But I wonder if this question of influence, right? If you had a, if you zoom out for a moment, if you had a sense of, is there a theory of influence that you're operating with across the book? Or is it this sort of notion of influence sort of parasitic on the particular figures, drawing from, what does Baldwin do and say? What does Angela Davis do and say? Or do you feel like uh, your own role as a reader and interpreter of these figures deploys a sense of influence that's worth articulating in a broader sense outside the specific cases in each chapter?
That's a great question. So I'll start with the sort of first parts of that and just try to identify what's going on in the book itself. I had basically three evidentiary modes or theories of influence. Nothing. I wasn't drawing on any specific theory of influence, but just how, or I think I might call it transmission instead. How is this being transmitted from one side to the other?
Mm-hmm.
And the first was just direct transmission. Davis is in Frankfurt studying with a door. So it wasn't too hard to draw the. Now, there's more to that, but that would involve the second part of the question, which I'll come to in a second. The second one was inferential, and it relied on books that the authors had read or conversations that were recorded that we have and that we know that they were
Mm-hmm.
thinking about. Cleaver's clearly read Marx, but also Plato, because he uses symposium quite a bit in his. I didn't talk about it too much in the book, but it's there.
Hmm.
And Malcolm X gives a list of what he read and what he rejected and so on.
Yeah.
And then I sort of assume or hope or think that some of that must have been retained or used in some way. The last part is, of course, purely speculative and has to do with what's happening at the time during these years, or during the years in which these thinkers were coming to maturity. And most of the German critical theorists that I mentioned in the book were public intellectuals in the United States. Not all of them. For instance, Gadamer wasn't, but Gadamer was quite huge by the mid '60s in theological circles in the United States, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily philosophical circles, because Truth and Method hadn't been translated yet. But there were texts circulating, and one was expected to have read Truth and Method in German.
Mm-hmm.
And so I certainly believe it's possible and probable that some of these thinkers would have been familiar with Arendt, even though maybe they hadn't read her works, or some of the thinkers would have been familiar with Marcuse's work, even though they hadn't studied with him, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. Now, the second part of that question is just, as I understand it, a more, do I have, outside of the sort of, as you said, parasitical moments of what is Baldwin doing, what is Davis doing here, what is X doing here, do I have a wider theory of influence, or an idea of why these two traditions might speak to each other, and what does that mean? It would be, as where there was opportunity, there was also need, and there were intellectual needs in order to articulate specific concerns specific to African American intellectuals and to German intellectuals,
Mm-hmm.
but that they needed to supplement each other in order to say what needed to be said, because the situation had become too complicated by the mid 20th century simply to take the stance that there's this race and that race, and never the twain shall meet.
Mm-hmm.
They simply could not formulate the 20th century as an archive and as a philosophical problem without reference to each other in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And where this is purported to have happened, I generally tend to think, and this would be my own approach, that if you scratch the surface hard enough, you'll tend to find much more going on than a single monological tradition at work, moving through any given philosopher, author, etc. My example out of my own work would be the Kafka book, where certainly Kafka's the novelty of that for me, aside from just a lifelong love of Kafka, was that I don't think anyone would have thought, well, scratch the surface and you'll find you'll find some African American authors or African American culture in or flowing through Kafka's entire
Hmm.
oeuvre. But in fact, you can and you do, and it's not simply a whimsy on my part. There's actual textual evidence and historical evidence and biographical evidence that
Hmm.
supports this. But we have to want to go there, and we have to want to see that influence and be able to excavate it. And that's pretty much what I've been trying to do.
Yeah, you mentioned Gadamer, and which I've been waiting for a little bit of a Gadamer renaissance at some point that I'm not sure is ever coming. But I mean, his work on the beautiful, of course, truth and method. I just think it's endlessly relevant. What it gathers to it, but so much of what you're saying gets inside the hermeneutic situation, right? That we have to be open to how the text speaks to us,
Hmm.
right? And speaks to us at multiple levels, right? Its explicit message and also its sort of sideline citations and what those mean, right? And so, what part of being doing hermeneutics, with integrity is tracing out and chasing down those small citations. But there's also the part of the hermeneutic situation of we approach the text as readers. We approach the text with something in mind, and that interplay between. Um, and I have to say, just in general, I mean, you mentioned the Kafka book, which is fantastic. I remember reading that and being thinking, in a playful way, but I did think, could this possibly be possible? I mean, as you said, it's not something that somebody says, "Oh, here's what you'll find when you talk about Kafka," but the I think this phenomenal Blackness book, you know, draws us into, right, uh, in a really deliberate and intense way, into the hermeneutical situation of your own scholarship. That I think we really see that. And so that question of influence is interesting to me because what you do is chase down these side notes, these footnotes, these life moments or allusions or figures, and you trace them out in the text to where they come from and what those implications would be. um, but in what you were saying, both in response to that last question and across this conversation, is really also detailing your own frame that you bring to the text, which I think is really unique and really needed. I think it breathes phenomenal Blackness. Certainly breathes a lot of new and different life into canonical African American literary and political figures. Um, and I like that
So
you do that without a sort of, here's a statement about the nature of, say, Ellison. And instead, that the writing draws us into that hermeneutic event of your own reading.
yeah, I wouldn't say that my ultimate goal was novelty, but it certainly is part of that in the sense that, and I maybe forecast ahead now to the King book a little bit. We've been thinking about and writing about King for 60 plus year, and it's it's not that there's nothing new to say, but I think that there's still more to say that has never even been thought. I just want to go back to these texts and think about how they were made and what it took to produce these thoughts and to transform them into something that became meaningful for African
Hmm.
American life. Where does it come from? And when I ask that, I don't simply mean one's experience. Where does one come from? But where does the thought come from? The thought is not the experience; it's
Yeah.
imbricated in it. And so there's a tradition there, or multiple traditions there that are intertwined. It's a type of intertwining that need to be extricated from each other and looked at in order better to understand not just the thought but the experience, right? To come back,
Mm-hmm.
always back to the experience and what it means and what it could mean. And so taking another look, so to speak, and saying, well, what else is there? Because there's always more there. The text is infinite. um, I think we start to find something liberating. Even in a book like Black Fascism, the first one, the point really wasn't to upset anybody, although perhaps it did,
I'm
but
sure. I'm
simply
sure that it did. Another great, fantastic book, but yeah,
it was simply to sort of follow Ralph Ellison and insisting on the fullness of Black life and the three dimensionality of it, and that includes its glories, but it also includes its faults and its stumbles.
yeah.
So,
So let me ask you about, to think about this exchange that you stage in this book, especially, um, and I think also the King book, um, but this, in your own writing, but we just focus on phenomenal blackness or expand however you like. Um, Ask a question that's really as much about sort of academic politics and ethics as anything, which is the politics of citation, which has become, I think, in the last decade, a really, really fraught space around, what, the I think a lot of critiques of comparative work, right, about what it means to bring, in this case, African American thought and German critical theory together, to talk about lines of influence, frames of interpretation, and so forth. And I know there's a lot of pushback to that, and so I'm curious what your thoughts are. I mean, in some ways, you spoke directly to it, right? That's just
mm.
textually and historically not the way intellectual life unfolded. But I did want to ask that sort of politics question, the citation question, and get your thoughts on it, and also ask if you think that this sort of work that you do, which is not comparative work, right? I mean, myself, most of my scholarship is comparative work, but you're doing something very different in terms of citations, um, citational practices. But I wonder if both how you think about your own book and the politics of citation, but also what your own thoughts on that might say about the future of the study of Black life, whether it's Black studies or Africana studies as a field, or just literary and cultural studies around Black life.
So a quick anecdote, which I now have many years on, told a few times, but I'll tell again very quickly, and that is when I first started out, I was giving a talk based on the Garvey chapter in Black Fascism. Very long Q&A ensued, um, and one of the last questions, someone raises their hand and says, "Well, I get what you're saying. I believe what you're saying. It's not a question of, oh my God, Marcus Garvey was saying that. No, I believe it. My question for you is, why would you say it?" And I had, I was not prepared for a direct question. So, I mean, my answer was just
It's a
naive and
clarifying it's a
uh,
clarifying question in the sense of there's no way to,
uh,
to answer it other
and
than
so I
directly.
just said, and it's a source of both, a source of embarrassment a little bit. I just said spontaneously because it's true, right? It's true, and I thought that's what we were supposed to be doing. Um, and I still think that's what we're supposed to be doing, wherever that leads. Um, I understand the other side of that much better now than I maybe did 15, 20 years ago. But I still sort of insist on that if Martin Luther King Jr. in his dissertation is engaging with Heidegger, which he is, or then maybe we should look at that and ask about it and see what it does. Or if Angela Davis studied with Herbert Marcuse or Adorno, or maybe we should look at that and ask what it does, because she doesn't back away from that. She still talks about Marcuse and the influence
Hmm.
that he had. Or if Malcolm X is saying, "Yeah, I read Kant. I want to know about it," and
Hmm.
maybe that isn't the most expedient political practice within the profession or within the academy, so to speak. But I think it's a useful one, and I think that there we have enough of every other type of work that maybe there's room for this as well. Let's think about these things. Now, the future of of the field and the discipline at large, I think is probably going more in this direction than in the one that would exclude these citational practices. Um, there are probably a lot of reasons for that, which just generally seem to have to do with how institutions are starting to imagine themselves and their pedagogical mission, and how they imagine translating that into a sustainable future for the humanities and what they'll need in so-called interdisciplinary work and thought and so on. But so often I look across at absolutely amazing scholars working within African American studies departments, or in some cases programs or centers and so on, um, clustered there in just what amounts to really something to behold in terms of the intellectual breadth of what they're offering and what they can do as a group on campus. But then I look at surrounding departments, whatever they may be, whichever ones within the humanities, social science, where there would seem to be that type of presence is maybe not there. And what I hope to see change in the future is this type of I won't call it isolation, but a type of intellectual closure that might be taking place on campus itself, where the interplay and interchange of and the sharing of students and ideas might not be as fluid as we might like. And
Mm-hmm.
I hope that people doing this type of works, citational work, let's call it, just as a shorthand, will be able to start to open that up more. I'm not saying there aren't openings now, but I think that it needs to be this type of integration needs to take place on campus, where there
Mm-hmm.
are multiple appointment people who are able to have their students interact with students from other areas and other departments in ways that they're not interacting right now,
Mm-hmm.
to for a much fuller university experience.
I mean, it reminds me, just like as a personal anecdote, of teaching a class on race and the Enlightenment, and having a bunch of philosophy majors. I was in a Black Studies department, and a bunch of philosophy majors in the course, and then getting complaints, but also a lot of energy, which I think, complaints aren't always a bad thing, from philosophy department professors who were saying, I can't teach Hume, I can't teach Hegel and Kant without these questions about colonialism and the concept of race and its relation to ethics and epistemology. And it bled over in ways that were difficult, but I mean, I really like the way you put that in terms of of breaking through some of those silos and senses of social but also epistemological isolation that happen in campus intellectual life.
Some of the pushback that one can get can be interesting from colleagues in the same department, other departments, where you start to introduce this element into a discipline that maybe isn't quite used to having to talk about these and isn't really
Yeah.
always prepared to have these conversations with students who are now very curious. The thing is, the students are coming with these questions anyway, and
Hmm.
it's time to a department, let's say a German department, for instance, needs to be able to have them
Yeah.
one way
Yeah.
or another. We can't just go behind a wall and start saying, but what about, it's none of that. That doesn't apply to me.
Yeah.
It might not apply to your scholarship, but it applies to your discipline.
Yeah.
And increasingly, students are coming in with a lot of questions that we have to be ready to answer, or to be able to refer them to someone who can, or at
Yeah.
least to have these dialogues. And I think that that's that benefit of these types of citational practices.
It also reminds me in terms of some of the, and this is as much as just a sort of associative thing for me, but in what you were saying around these citational practices, it did resonate with, something Derek Walcott said when he was asked about, his sort of theoretical embrace in his essays, but also in his poetry of Caribbean vernacular culture. And he was asked, well, why do you write in English, right? Why don't you write in a Creole or Patois of St. Lucia, or, sort of command this for other Caribbean poets? And he said a lot of things, but one of the things he said that really stood out for me in response to that problem was, you know, he said, I just don't believe that English is a language that's a property of the English, right? It's a global language now. And once it's a global language, I can do with it what I want. It was interesting for me, a kind of decolonial move around
Mm.
saying, we don't have anything to fear from these ideas because they're not actually the possession of empire, that they were what they once were. And, I saw at a very philosophical level in your works, this phenomenal Blackness, but also previous works, um, a really philosophical, metaphysical, ontological, and epistemological way of doing a similar thing of, there's nothing to, in this case, there's nothing to fear if you're writing on African American figures about German critical theory, right? Because part of the
Yeah.
force of these intellectuals, I mean, because you don't, I mentioned the names, Baldwin, Malcolm X, and so forth. These are massive, paradigm shifting writers. And so the space for exchange is in different citational practices is actually something we ought to run towards. I mean, this is my own sort of pontification here, but we ought to run toward, because there's nothing to fear. And that sort of force of empire is kind of gone. And I think you were right in what you were saying about German critical theory. It itself is working against any of those kind of imperial deployments. Uh, I think probably partly the biography of, German Jews. I mean, what are they going to do? Defend German imperial ambitions? I mean, of course not, right? So there's something in the theory that sort of disassembles that. But also, I think from the African American intellectual tradition, it's like Walcott in English. It's a part of the world now.
To a more speculative association, but to associate Malcolm X with Habermas and thinking about the public sphere doesn't diminish Malcolm X's work or achievement in any way. And to ask why wouldn't I could have turned that question, the Garvey lecture question, around and simply said, why wouldn't I do it? Because then we force an articulation of a certain notion of diminishment. Like, so if you do this, does this mean somehow, if you've pointed to Angela Davis's debt to Marcuse, let's say, and does this mean that she's not some type of organic intellectual who's articulating a form of blackness? And the moment we do that, we're back into the very thing that we've been trying to avoid, and something that I was criticized for bringing up in Phenomenal Blackness, which is a type of essentialism, right? What are we expecting? How could Angela Davis be anything but an amalgam of different intellectual traditions? How would that work otherwise? Where would she have? How would she have formulated any of these ideas, and where would she have been able to to say them and be understood?
Yeah.
His notion of that type of public sphere, which Malcolm X is thinking about, which he did understand as monological, um, sort of forecloses on any type of non-citational reading. Right? There always has to be some dialogue going on somewhere, because otherwise the two sides can't understand each other at all. Only sort of remotely and at a distance, and as if through a glass darkly. So I just don't really see the point in avoiding citation, and then it becomes a critic's choice, right? Decide how you want to frame that and what your goal is, and then do that.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I really like that. That's a fantastic take. I'm glad you, what did you call it? A speculative association. I like that a lot. Let me, um, let me ask you about this sentence at the end of the book. I know it's probably strange. I mean, it would be strange for me to have a sentence I wrote read back to me, but I love this sentence and I mused over it myself for a long, long time. And so I wanted to read it and ask you just to unpack it a little bit or reflect on it, because it seems to me to bring, I mean, it is by its own declaration, to bring together the thematic trajectory of the book in really important ways. And you say, this is the quotation. You write, the end of theory in African American literary criticism has become the impossible reconciliation, great phrase, impossible reconciliation of Leroy Jones's aesthetic universalism with blues particularism amid the ruins of ontology. So that universalism, particularism, and the ruins of ontology. It's a fantastic sentence.
So I should say that I wrote the this book and the King book simultaneously. So this sentence gestures towards something that will become, what is the focus of that book. But to unpack it without going there, what I'm trying to point to is that currently where we reflect aesthetically, rhapsodically, and critically on Blackness today, there is an ontology of Blackness present. However, to draw that out, to shape it and to present it as such, simply isn't a move that I think many of us want to make at the moment. And so we are at conflicting ends. On the one hand, we are using ontological language and arguments in order to present something that we are refusing to say is ontological. And so, because ontology is in itself is in a type of ruins when faced with something like racial particularism, in which we have to decide what does it mean to be black, to be white, to be this, to be that, if in fact all of these meanings lead to one thing, which is oppression, racism, and the inhuman treatment of the other. And so, what do we do? How do we end that thought without flipping the script and simply prescribing something like essentialism?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to reflect on the being of blackness or the blackness of being, etc., however you want to spin that phrase, then I'm at least tacitly suggesting that there is something like an essence there, an ontology there. We have all sorts of problems open up. Is that what is blackness? Does it pertain to the entire diaspora, to all black, or is there an African American ontology at work that is separate from? These questions keep multiplying.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time we're finished asking them, we realize that we're only finished because we had to draw a line somewhere, but that we could just go on all day running in circles. And so while I admire much of what we have today as African American theory or Black theory, I'm also somewhat dismayed by the move away from a much more materialist approach, a much more historicist approach, because it seems to reinscribe some of the very problems that we've been trying to dismantle. And so we look across the landscape and see the so-called ruins of ontology, because you can't fall back into ontology. You can't talk about ontology anymore without thinking about how it's imbricated with racism. But on the other hand, to say anything seems to bring us back to that, unless we move back to that, fall back on that sociological position that
Uh-huh.
we stepped out of,
Yeah.
or started to step out of with Baldwin. And so, what do we do? And therein lies the problem.
Fantastic. It's really, really interesting. Um, so let me ask you about about your own thought on readers. Readers, they read the book. I mentioned the hermeneutical situation previously. I mean, they people bring to books what they bring, and they take away what they take away. But I'm wondering about you as an author. You know what would you say you as the author of this book want us to walk away with? And I mean that in terms of, how do you want the reader's sensibility to be shaped or reshaped or in somehow impacted by the book?
So I think at the end of the last page, I'd like the ideal reader at least to think to themselves, well, there was much more going on here than I thought.
Mm.
That is to say that some an author who's been worked over as much as James Baldwin, that this is this is new to me, and but it's vital, and it will
Mhm.
help me think about how I read Baldwin in the future. I don't necessarily need anything in Phenomenal Blackness to determine how one reads. I don't think that's possible.
Sure.
But I hope it's a part of the conversation in how we approach not just these individual figures, but the period in general and Black Power in general. But also, if the reader happens to be um, an academic or a how we start to think of what our own work and how we're framing our arguments and what does it mean to be working in theory or philosophy and so on as a type of artifact production of Black life. Where does this fit on that scale of, am I reproducing an essentialist argument, or am I critiquing it? Am I undermining a racist aspect of Western metaphysical tradition, or if I somehow reintroduced it? These are serious questions and hard
Yeah.
questions, at least they were for me, but I felt they had to be asked. Ultimately, this project began a long, long time ago when I tried to think of. It began with Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, which of course is not in this particular text, but comes later, and how violence and nonviolence, what they might, how I might be able to think about them if I thought about Benjamin's critique of violence alongside. What would
Mm.
this do?
Mhm.
And then I started to realize that when you do when you start to, when I you start to do the types of things that I want to do, which is read these authors together, if authorized to do so by the textual history or the biography and so on,
Mhm.
by history, let's say. What happens when you import or export or put alongside Benjamin and Martin Luther King Jr.? Does something unintended happen?
Yeah.
What happens when you read the African American literary tradition as a Heideggerian or through Heidegger? Does
Uh-huh.
something very unwanted come in? Do we have an unwanted guest, so to speak, a ghost
Hmm.
that now enters the text and starts to do some of the things we never really wanted to have happen? The answer was yes.
Mhm.
I think actually we do import the entire archive that Heidegger brings with him, his baggage when he comes to stay, and that unless we start to interrogate that rigorously, we can still use these figures, still read these traditions together. But we
Mhm.
have to be very careful about how that happens. And it
Yeah.
cannot simply sound good. It has to
Mm.
work, and it has to work ethically. And that's what I hope a reader might come away thinking, wanting to do, and maybe more empowered to do at the end of that book.
Well, I think, as a theorist and philosopher reading the book, I think that is absolutely the effect of this book, and the concluding pages, I think, really drive that home so much. But let me turn that question then around to you. I mean, you've spoken even just now a little bit to it, but how do you walk away from this book? You've mentioned this, this new project, a similar project forthcoming that you wrote at the same time on King Jr. But in terms of your own sensibilities, how has the book put what has the book put in motion for you in terms of what comes next? And I partly mean that in terms of, what's your next project? Of course, everybody always wants to know, but just in terms of, what it meant, because you did shift decades ahead, so it's a different sensibility that you engaged in, as a scholar. And so I wonder about how your own sensibilities were transformed by, by this book and how they're in the King book and things to come.
Well, it actually sharpened my attention, my attentiveness to theology in
Interesting.
this discourse, because often, um, and hopefully this again will be one of the conclusions I draw in the later book, but ultimately to avoid philosophical essentialism or ontological essentialism, there's a fall back into a theological approach that we see
Hmm.
in Martin Luther King Jr.'s thought that almost ironically enables a much more pragmatic activist approach and a translation of these ideas into action that would have been otherwise either impossible or utterly disingenuous had they stayed completely within a philosophical register. And so that I started to wonder, where does that come from? And it turns out to be the root of the thought to begin with, and that's why I've moved back in time for the project that I'm working on right now, in order to see how senses of election, of chosenness, of race in
Hmm.
law and philosophy in the 19th century primarily start to shape these types of theological responses that we start to see that seek somehow to talk about race, but to do so outside of absolute terms, where it's much more contingent in nature, but grounded in something that is other than nature, or um, or even a type of intentional supreme being. With King, it's love, right? This is exactly where we want to end.
Yeah.
if we if we have to have some type of final ground for in order to undo race in its entirety, that's what it has to be. There's an inevitability to that thought that I have been trying to trace in my most recent work.
Well, I can't wait to read this new project, the King book, but this turn to the 19th century. Um, that's gonna it would be another chapter. All of your books are extremely unique contributions, right? Open up new horizons of thought. But that return to the 19th century and to the theological, um, certainly for somebody like me, and there are lots of us out there, hopefully, this is a book I can't wait to see. So I look forward to, you know, finding ways to catch sight and catch glimpses of it as you go along. But I really appreciate you making the time to talk about phenomenal blackness and about your work generally today. It's this has been
Thanks.
extremely interesting. I really mean it.
Oh,
Thank you.
thanks for having me.
All right. Well, take care.
You too.